Dr. Danielle Bailey is the director of the Center of Excellence in Teaching and Learning, and is an associate professor for criminal justice at the University of Texas at Tyler. She developed a forensic science program at UT Tyler in 2016 and has some really exciting stuff going on. So you're welcome to share that if you feel inclined to. She also serves as a forensic science program coordinator since it was created. She holds a PhD in criminology and criminal justice from the University of Nebraska at Omaha, which is why we were just talking about Nebraska, a master's of forensic science, and then also a bachelor's in forensic and investigative science. So again, she's also a CASA volunteer, so we're really excited to have her here, really excited to hear her perspectives, and I am going to pass the torch to you, Dr. Bailey. Absolutely.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for those of you who are joining us via Zoom. So I wanted to give you a little background, but Jared covered most of it. But just to kind of highlight, so I am here more in my capacity as the associate professor of criminal justice, and in particular, I do not specialize in the foster care system specifically, but actually my emphasis over the last 10 years has been looking at policies for those individuals who are on the sex offender registry. And I focus specifically on those individuals, things that happen in their lives as a result of our policies and as a result of the registry itself. And I focus on how that impacts their family members and their loved ones. And so there's a lot of similarities between what children and spouses and parents of registered offenders experience as individuals, as children experience in the foster care system. And it's one of those, they have been dealt a label that's not in any way, shape, affected by their own behaviors and characteristics. And so, unfortunately, there's a lot of similarities there. And so I just bring that up. That's my dissertation was specifically on family support networks of sex offenders and focusing on shame and isolation and some of the impacts of that. If you want to scan this at any point, or I'll share this, but feel free if you would like to reach out. I've given you my contact information here. And then I also have a professional website that has all of my research and some of my teaching items as well. And it has some cool pictures of my my students in progress. Jared mentioned forensic science. So I actually just created a crime scene complex for UT Tyler. We're up at the 271 Health Science Campus. We have 4 simulated residential apartments, and I have students working there on Tuesday nights to practice their crime scene processing skills. So we're sketching fake mannequins and looking for evidence. And I am probably the only professor on campus that walks around with like a mannequin over one shoulder, a bag of bongs and illegal drugs and some fake money, jewelry, all that good stuff. And I'm like, all right, where am I with the bong today? So it's all for, all in good work. So for today, these are our learning objectives here. So my hope is that by the end of this workshop, you're going to be able to define what stigma actually is, describe the consequences of stigmatization on both the identity and the mental health of youth that are in the foster care system. I'm going to give you a little bit of findings from research studies, and particularly some of these research studies have children's voices as part of it. I think it's really important to hear straight from the children and what they're experiencing. So I have some of that in here as well. And then at the end, we'll talk a lot about proposing strategies to reduce the stigma and then also support the well-being of those youth that are in the foster care system. So I will do some engagement components. So there'll be some times in the talk where I'm going to pause. I'm going to ask us to talk amongst ourselves. And what I've found is best is, everybody's a little bit different. Some people you get the immediate thought that comes to your head. My husband's like that, like he can make a comeback like right away. I'm the person, I just need to sit and reflect on it for a second, and then I can write you a book report, but I need that minute to, think it through. And so what we're going to do is when we get to those pause and reflect discussions, I'm going to ask you to take about 2 minutes to sit quietly with your thoughts, and you can write some down. And then after we have a period for that quiet reflection, then actually asking you guys to share. And those of you on Zoom, I have the chat up here, so I'll be monitoring the chat. And so I'll be able to bring in your comments from the chat as well. So you'll be able to share in that reflection. So when we talk about what stigma actually is, there's a lot of literature on this, and we go back to one of the original promoters of this idea of stigmatization is Goffman in 1963. And Goffman defines stigma as a social construct that's based on some kind of difference between the individual and the collective norm or the rest of society in some way. And so obviously this is pretty broad, right? We can make an other out of anything. And as a result, Goffman argued that as a result of the stigma, the individual is then marked as either tainted or somehow devalued as a result of that stigma. And that can result in some prejudice and discrimination going forward. Goffman's original theory argued that there were 3 types of stigma, or 3 reasons that stigma arises. We have physical characteristics, so deformities in terms of, or not deformities, but alternative facial characteristics, body characteristics, something that not necessarily is mainstream for everybody. We also have the character stigma, and that's focusing on moral failing traits. So things like a criminal history, a mental health disorder, addiction issues, things like that are a result of the person's character, or seen as the person's character. And then the last one, and this is really the focus for today, is Goffman's idea of a tribal stigma. And what he meant by tribal stigma was simply that the person is in some way associated with a group of individuals that is subsequently devalued. And so that tribal status becomes this primary label for the individual. And so obviously with youth involved in the foster care system, we may have some stigma from other issues as well. There may be a physical stigma in addition. There may be a character stigma, particularly if the child has mental health issues or maybe has experienced some addiction concerns. But typically we're looking at this tribal stigma, which is, the child by themselves has done nothing, has nothing different about them, but they belong to this other group. And that is going to result in a series of outcomes in their life that they can't control. So what does stigma result in? How do you experience stigma? So those who are not in the foster care system, there's 3 kind of, big things here. So one is that we somehow perceive youth in foster care to be the other. And that, again, doesn't have to be a bad other, but it's like there's us and then there's them. And anytime we make that divide, that's really where we're opening ourselves up to, once they become them, I can have different ideas and it doesn't reflect on my own value. And so that opens itself up to some really problematic thought patterns. The second thing is we may hold negative opinions of those in foster care. One of the challenges is that a lot of individuals don't know a lot about the foster care system. So what they experience is either what they've been told, what they've heard from other people, or what they've observed. So if you've met one foster child, you are going to end up, potentially saying, okay, well, all of them are like Johnny B, because that's who I know, and so that can be problematic. And then those who are not in the system can either have explicit or implicit bias. And those of you probably familiar from other continuing ed, I'm sure Jared, well, I think we talked about it in our training as well, this idea of, explicit bias, I'm purposely doing something to discriminate in some way, but implicit bias is simply, I have this idea in my head and it's changing how I respond to this individual. And it's when we hear the word bias, it gets everybody's defenses up because they're like, I don't want to be biased. But unfortunately, with implicit bias, one of the challenges is we're not even aware that is happening in our thinking. And so there are things that are happening to these children that are not the result of, I don't like foster kids or anything, but is the result simply of, I have these preconceived notions in my head, and those are informing what I do, say, and think. Regardless, I don't even realize that that's actually happening mentally. So I'm going to pause here for our first reflect and discuss. I want you to think for a couple of minutes, what stereotypes of youth in foster care or caregivers of youth in foster care have you either heard about from others, you've observed before? Excuse me. So I'll take just about 2 minutes, think through it quietly. Feel free to write some notes. Grab my timer here. $120 is a really long time to be silent. I'm like looking at my clock like. Okay, we're gonna call it good. I think that was about 90 seconds. So go ahead and share with those around you some stereotypes, and then I'll ask for some discussion as well. So those of you who are on Zoom, if you would like to add on to the chat, I will include you there.
So now they're thinking.
Yeah, that was one that came out of my bag. At 8 years.
I've heard. Now that I've been in it.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you're saying. I've heard too. Special care kids doing that. If you're being on time, more special.
Is it, can I write it back?
Yeah, absolutely. If there's anything on there, you can actually.
Actually engaging.
It'll help me a little bit.
Sorry. I think another stereotype too is like when we do see accessibility,
Almost just because it's just magnetic.
they're still biased.
Oh, does it?
It used to be.
And so that's the reason when you start testimony about it, you want to have things for them to continue. If you also look at them as if someone who didn't know them was so they have a good job, whereas somebody that sorry, that happens to be the point. They have a problem too. It's like looking at case, knowing how to word they did. Still looking at
Yeah. And those parents who said it's just such a cause for success, really.
Yeah.
And help the change 5%.
Yeah.
And having discussions to look at them. Things I know that from her, the strategy, and then you have the language assessments. My parents really helped out. And then, you talk down in the garden, so don't pray, I see them. We talk about this. Yeah, or the stereotypes about those parents, yeah. And we didn't have the same. I don't think 30. And see it. Yeah, as much as we They call them. Right. Good name. Okay.
And they already see it as well. Yeah, and here's what it says. So even if they are doing the wrong thing. It was all.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what I'm learning.
Back here. Well, at least it's focused. I kind of saw you guys at my peripheral there.
Yes, right.
Okay, so what are some of the stereotypes we got? I'm gonna start us off with our chat. We had two that we took, oh, okay, red's not gonna work. I was going for a different color, but I'm gonna mix it up. So in chat, we talked about this stereotype that children in foster care are shy and very quiet, withdrawn. We also, somebody brought up seen as a troublemaker. What did you guys? Whoops.
Always from a poor family.
Okay. So,
Which is.
Poor home.
It's not true.
Okay, so always relating it back to this idea of poverty. Okay, what else did you guys?
Ours, troublemaker.
Troublemaker, okay.
They are difficult to act out.
No, good. What else did you say back there?
I said broken would be in that same qualification.
Broken.
Unable to bond.
Unable to bond, okay. Very squeaky marker. All right, so kind of the gamut here, right? But we have this definite idea that, there's a lot of really negative stereotypes that are associated with this population. Unable to bond, being shy, being isolate, being this loner, coming from a poor family, having trouble regulating their emotions, getting into trouble a lot, acting out, having inappropriate behaviors, etc. Just overall that idea of like the broken child. Anything else?
Kind of taking the broken to the next step, that they're easily fixable just by love.
Okay.
Yeah.
So all they need is someone to be like, oh, I love you. And then, everything will be good, right? Any positive stereotypes?
Resourceful.
Resourceful, okay. And this goes back, a lot of times to that idea, like they're probably from a poor family or from poverty, so they've gotten this far, they have to be pretty resourceful, okay?
Resilient.
Resilient, okay. On that same line. So I mentioned these, obviously the first thing out of our brains was probably the negative, right? That's really what comes to mind a lot of times, unfortunately. And, you have to figure if you're in this classroom virtually, you already have an above normal interest in this population. And yet still all the stereotypes that we come to are mostly negative until we, really start thinking, okay, well, what's our positive stereotypes that we thought about? And so you can imagine someone who's less informed about the system, who has less information about it, who may only have contact via, somebody in school that when I was growing up was in foster care. Like that may be their only ability to identify what foster care actually is. And so, the potential for these negative stereotypes is even higher with a population that's less informed, basically. So obviously, this has significant impacts on the child and the children that are in the foster care. And in particular, one of the biggest challenges that we have is this internalization of the other label. And we see this a lot in criminal justice research as well. We can, it's called labeling theory. It's this idea that we put a label onto somebody for whatever reason. And it can be a positive or it can be a negative label. And then what happens is that every time that person acts in a certain way that corresponds with that label, we're like, oh yeah, see, told you. And what happens over time is that child or that person learns, you know what, everyone's just going to assume I'm like this anyway. I'm going to act that way. And so we get what we call this internalization of that label. And in criminal justice, we're also looking at the internalization of that criminal label. So if you're going to treat me like I'm a bad kid, or if you're going to treat me like I'm a criminal, then at some point I'm like, yeah, what's the point? I'm just going to do what I want to do and break the laws when I need to, because you're going to assume I'm going to do it anyway. So the internalization is a big challenge. That doesn't happen right away. That's a process over time. It's a process of having these expectations, having these things put upon us. But it happens, and can lead to some worse consequences down the road. Man, I'm just taking it over here. So again, as a result then of these explicit and implicit biases, these negative opinions, then these children may experience discrimination and prejudice, possibly on purpose. Hey, all kids in foster care are troublemakers, so I don't want that type of person around my child. Or it could just be something of, hey, we're putting together, we're going to go on a field trip and it costs $50 a child. Well, I'm not even going to bother asking this person because they're in foster care. They're not going to be able to afford it anyway. So, it's not always I purposely think this child is bad, but I have these opinions that inform how I react to this child. And what the literature talks about is, as a result of this internalization of the other label, as a result of this discrimination and this prejudice, that individual often loses social status with their peers, and they may lose advancement possibilities, like the field trip. Well, I didn't even get asked to go on the field trip because I just assumed you wouldn't want to go, so I didn't bother. Or I know you have to ride the bus because your caregiver can't pick you up from school, because you don't have mom and dad to come pick you up after school. So I'm not going to invite you to be part of this club, or I'm not going to invite you to be part of, what do they call it? In the schools, they do it's like UA or something. No. UIL. There we go. The UIL program, right? Because that's usually an after school commitment. And so, I just assume, you're not going to have transportation to do it, so I'm not going to do it. So what happens is these children lose the opportunity to show off their skills, which further reinforces a lot of these challenges that they're experiencing. This is kind of a seminal piece that a lot of people refer to. Cools in 1997 actually went and interviewed children. I will say, from a researcher standpoint, it's hard to get access to children, because obviously we don't want to just put young children in any type of research study. So there's not as much research out there that's like in depth. I talked to this child and let them express how they feel. A lot of what we see is older adolescents, and we also do a lot of research on people that were formerly in foster care as well. So Cools is one of the first ones that was actually able to interview individuals that are in the foster care system at the time. And she did 17 interviews with adolescents in foster care. And these individuals ranged from 15 to 19. And then she talked about some of the common findings that she found. And so first was this perception of bias. And this is really important because this has a lot of impact on our behavior. I say perceptions of bias because I'm not sure that these children, everybody in their life felt that way or held those stereotyped views. But to those adolescents, there was a perception that everybody in their social environment, their teachers, their peers, the other adults in their lives, anybody in that social environment, they had the perception, they have this idea that I'm either delinquent or I'm psychologically impaired. And so that is going to affect not only how they respond to me, but how I respond to them, because I'm just going to assume that they assume. So we get into this cycle of assumptions. Bullying is a huge problem. The literature talks a lot about foster care children being bullied by those who are in their peer groups. And so Cool talked about these were, regularly confronted with the abnormality. The status of being in foster care came up repeatedly. And that status came with this inferiority. If you're in this, it's because your parents don't love you, or it's because you're too poor, because your parents can't take care of you, or because you're a troublemaker. And so as a result, that became a situation where they were exposed to a lot of ridicule, a lot of teasing, and that affects, the child to a large extent. We also have this idea Cool's found. The children talked a lot about this intrusive scrutiny. You know, all of a sudden you're part of this system, and now all of a sudden you have all these adults and peers that are now like, oh, well, you're in the foster care system. Why are you in the foster care system? What your parents do? Do your parents love you? Did they pick you up from school? How often do you see your mom and dad? Do they come visit you? Oh, they don't come visit you. Do you talk to them on the phone? You know, like it's like people saw your status and then they were like, oh, well, I can just ask you all these questions. Whereas most people don't, you know, get asked about your nighttime routine with your mom and dad at all the time. So it opened them up to this intrusive scrutiny, and it that as a whole really enhanced their feeling of other. You know, these aren't questions that you ask Johnny, who's got mom and dad. So why am I getting those questions? I'm getting those questions because I'm in foster care. So I'm somehow different than the rest of my peers. And then a huge issue is this isolation. And again, this is, I see this in my research too, with children of registrants. It is a self-isolation and a socially imposed isolation. So it's a socially imposed isolation in that there are things that are happening that create a disconnect for the child, but there's also a lot of, I have perceptions that everybody doesn't like me or has these negative feelings towards me. I've been teased in the past and I'm afraid of it happening again. And so what happens is I shut down and just become quiet little mouse in the corner, because otherwise if I contribute, what's the point, basically? And so, you know, very socially disconnected. These are some of the outcomes that the research talks about, in specifically for foster children. And I purposely put some black lines here because I wanted to really highlight none of these works individually, right? And I'm sure, I mean, these are all impactful for adults as well. But definitely for those who are younger, who are still figuring out their identity, who are reliant on their peers and their caregivers for that sense of building self-esteem and sense of building that self-identity. We have a lot of challenges with having low self-esteem because of some of these stereotypes that are embodied against them. That can increase then our anxiety and depression rates. We see a lot higher rate of mental health concerns with children that are in the foster care system. That can lead to substance abuse disorders. If you have substance abuse disorders, that's going to open you up oftentimes to increased victimization. So a lot of these things are linked, where maybe, you know, there's a couple things that start, and then once it starts, it creates a chain of never-ending events. And so that was, you know, the reason to put all this together. Let's see here. So as I said, I wanted to bring in some research in their own words. And so these are some quotes from a researcher, Penning, that did her research looking at older adolescents in this system. And these were some of their experiences specifically about stigma. So this one, it says, I've never had a place to do my homework, support from parents to remind me why you have to do homework, having to do a family tree in class and not being able to easily explain it made me feel different. I would sometimes come up with quick stories so I wouldn't have to explain it over and over. And that just solidified my feeling of not belonging. Just simply saying I'm a foster kid was never satisfying. So, you know, this idea of there's activities that they are somehow alienated from. And these are, you know, that activity of building a family tree, that's not meant to create that otherness, right? That's meant to create this camaraderie and help you get to know your family and help you learn about how uncles and aunts are related to dads and sisters and everything else. But when you have this type of assignment and then you have the situation where a child doesn't feel like they fit that assignment, it can create that feeling of other, and that in turn helps them internalize that label. Living on campus as a foster kid was really hard because it becomes immediately obvious that you are extremely different. I never went on spring breaks. I never had the same home to go back to during summers or breaks, maybe similar to foreign exchange students. And I thought that was interesting that the individual actually compared themselves to like foreign exchange student. So they were, this individual, as you can tell, was in a group home that was a residential placement, residential placement at school. But I thought it was just interesting that was the group that they found. Okay, well, foreign exchange students are kind of like me. And so in some ways that actually might reduce some of that other feeling, because maybe now I can be like a foreign exchange student, right? But it still creates that sense of like, I'm not the normal, I'm not like the other kids around me, and that, can affect your identity. I felt like people always assumed that I was coming from a bad situation because I was in foster care, which made them feel like somehow I was partly to blame for that bad situation. Being in foster care never brought good thoughts to people's minds. And I feel like I could sense that every time. And here you see that anticipation and that perception of bias. Whether or not being in foster care actually did bring good into somebody's mind, we don't know. But we know that the child is assuming that it's going to bring bad things in, and that child is therefore going to respond with behavior that's appropriate to those assumptions. So I want obviously to, we know the problems, and I feel like I'm probably preaching to the choir with a lot of this because you probably are familiar with this idea. So I wanted to spend a lot of time talking about what we can do and actually thinking together as a group about some specific situations and identifying like what are some supports that we could create in this particular scenario. And so to do that, I want to explain another criminology theory, and this is called strain theory. It's a really basic discussion of strain theory, but essentially what that argues is that we all experience negative experiences throughout our lives. Whether that's I lost a job, it could be I stubbed my toe. I mean, negative experience can be anything, large or small. And as a result of that negative experience, we experience what we call strain, which is basically stress. And so as a result of that increased strain, we respond with a coping mechanism of some kind. So if you go into the literature for foster care, you can see a bunch of different common coping strategies that we see. So we see secrecy, isolation. There's some discussion about something relating to escapism, and I'll cover some examples of that in a few minutes. We also see an emphasis on using peer networks for support, caregiver support, and then also this last thing is kind of interesting, is something we call neutralization techniques. So neutralization techniques can be used for basically anything, but the idea of it is that you're using some kind of rationale to reduce your blame, to neutralize your responsibility or the negative aspect of something. So, for example, we see this with individuals who have committed offenses. There can be things like denial of injury. So I didn't actually hurt anybody. Like I was drunk driving, but I didn't actually hurt anybody, so it's not a big deal, right? Or I was smoking marijuana, but there's no victim. I'm the person that was smoking, so I was fine. You get this denial of injury. There's a bunch of different neutralization techniques. But this paper that came out just 2 years ago, they talked about, they were looking at females specifically who had aged out of the system, and they were looking at how do these females separate themselves from the negative stereotypes of females in foster care. And what they talked about was that these individuals were using this neutralization to somehow differentiate themselves from other foster children. So it was statements like, essentially like, I'm not like them. Like they did X, Y, and Z. They became prostitutes and runaways, but I did something different. And so there was a differentiation. They talked about a couple different pathways that I could take, but most of it was I'm either somehow not like them because I've done something different with my life, or the other neutralization technique they saw was, I wasn't as bad as them to begin with. Like I wasn't really part of that group, and trying to kind of make it like I was in foster care, but I wasn't in foster care. Like these kids were in foster care kind of thing. What was interesting about this discussion was what the authors talked about was here you have a youth who has aged out of the system and is using these neutralization techniques to support their positive identity going forward. But in reality, what they're actually doing is they're continuing the stereotypes, because what they're saying is, well, like I became successful, so I'm not like the foster care kids. Well, now you're actually perpetuating that stereotype of the other foster care kids that are not successful and cannot go on with their life positively. So there was actually this like in to support their identity, they were actually buying into the stereotypes of the identity itself, which was why I thought it was kind of interesting. So in strain theory, we talk about different coping strategies, and we can have positive coping and we can have negative coping. And not surprising, if you use negative coping strategies, then basically the idea is it becomes a cycle. So if I use a coping strategy that is somehow negative, then it's actually going to increase my strain or increase my stress, which is going to lead to additional negative experiences, and this whole cycle continues. What do you think are negative strategies on this slide? Drugs, okay. So these common coping strategies that we've identified up here in the literature, what ones would you consider negative? What do you think is going to increase?
Isolationism.
Secrecy, isolation, yep. You guys are on top of it. We actually, and this is where this escapism comes into play. So like you were saying with drugs, substance abuse becomes a way to escape from that label, to escape from the stress. And obviously we know if you get involved with substance abuse as a way to relieve that strain, that's actually more likely to lead you into additional experiences that are actually going to increase your strain long-term. So we do see, unfortunately, a lot of these coping strategies that the literature finds in children who are in foster care are considered negative coping strategies and are likely to not provide the protection and the self-identity reinforcement that the children are actually trying to go for. And then I labeled the neutralization techniques as negative coping again, because on one hand, they actually are protective, they're positive coping for the child themselves. That was, the authors were talking about, like, it actually provides that identity protection to that one specific child. But what you're doing is you're perpetuating the stereotype and hurting everybody else. So that's a little bit different, but it still achieves that same thing where it's still increasing stress and promoting that strain cycle. So obviously our goal is then to look for more positive coping techniques, and with the hope that we can actually decrease the strain and then basically get an off-ramp to this cycle. So, not stopping negative experiences from ever happening to you, but being able to find a way to positively work through that stress so that now you're not just creating a cycle of harm and stress together. And what do we think is positive up here?
Caregiver support.
Caregiver support. Okay, so reaching out to our caregivers or other influential people.
Peer networks.
Peer networks, absolutely. And then this is where I'm going to highlight escapism again. Actually, there were some interesting findings in the research that was talking about escapism through games or hobbies is a way that children can kind of take themselves out of that position. The one that really stuck with me is there was a quote from a child that said they discovered role-playing games. And when they were in role-playing games, they could make up their own background, they could make up their own life story. And so that was a way for them to escape from that identity. It was a positive, pro-social way. They weren't going to have any negative influences from it. And so it was a really positive way of escaping.
But can't some of the peer networks be negative?
That's okay. Good point. So hopefully peer networks would be positive, but you're right. We do have a lot of research out there. I mean, there is there's always a chicken and egg question in criminal justice. Like, do you become a criminal because of your peers? Yeah. Well, what's interesting, and I'll show this in a second, but one of the key things that they found with peer networks, in particular, what really helped children who were in the foster care system was networking with other peers in the foster care system. Because it was a way of, okay, if I am with other kids that are all part of this group, we can set aside the group identity for a second and we can be the people we are inside. And so they actually talked about, a lot of the children talked about the networking potential. And sometimes it was formal, like they made a support group for kids in foster care. Some of it was more accidental, like there was resources that were given to foster care caregivers, and then they would bring their children to these resources, and then the children would conglomerate together and meet each other and network. So some of it was purposeful, some of it was accidental, but meeting with children that were involved in the system in some way really helped them feel more normal. Absolutely.
So what if, you've got a double whammy if you have a foster child that also has something else like CP or that, or autism or something that already isolates them from what people consider norm.
Yep.
So you got a double whammy on some of these kids.
We call that intersectionality in the research world. So this idea that you have these different identities and all of those are intersecting together to affect how we're being perceived. So you're absolutely right. I mean, something as simple as a foster care male, a female versus a foster care child who identifies as maybe non-binary or transgender. All of those individuals already have another identity that's affecting how they're being viewed. And so then you're right, if you add in mental health concerns, if you add in behavioral concerns, I mean, these stereotypes exist because there have been children, of course, that have experienced some of these, right? We've had children in the foster care system because of poverty. We've had children in there because of problematic behavior. And so what happens is then, all these characteristics exist and then they all add on top of each other to affect how they're supported. Really, and I'll get to that in a second, but really, I mean, the key is being aware of the stigma and then trying to take active steps to counteract it. I mean, just so knowing, okay, they're stigmatized because they're in the system. They're also stigmatized because they have CP or, being able to really identify those can help. Because, for example, with the peer networks, if you have a child that has CP, for example, a CP specific support group would be helpful for the CP identity, but that's not handling that foster care identity as well. So if there's a way to.
Horse family. Or
Exactly.
whatever. I mean,
Exactly.
I live with my grandmother. I mean, it's the same thing, whether it's in the formal foster system or a different family dynamic.
Exactly. So, same thing as before. I'll try to actually shut up for 2 minutes. By the way, just educational development tidbit. They do a lot of studies on teachers asking questions. And the average teacher waits 7 seconds after asking, do you have any questions? Because it feels so awkward to stand up here for 2 minutes. So I actually I've learned from a fellow colleague, I stare at my clock because I'm like, okay, don't let myself talk until I see the time change. Because otherwise 20 seconds in, I'd be like, all right, that was a great 2 minutes. Let's go. So I want to start with some brainstorms. And then I've got some suggestions, and then we'll actually go through some examples and talk about specifically for that example, what can we do? So to start with, I just want you to think what is one thing, you can do more, that you can do to minimize stigma for youth in the foster care system. And this can be, something that's broad, the city could do something, or this could be tomorrow I could go out and do X, Y, and Z and make a change. So I'll give you 2 minutes to reflect individually. Now I got cold. Did you see that comment in the chat?
Maybe it'll unfreeze in a second.
I got a bandwidth error, so.
Oh.
All right, go ahead and share with those around you. And again, those of you on chat, feel free to jump this into the chat. Drop it into the chat.
One thing, you know, one of the things I was involved with TED Talks as a kid, so it had nothing to do with what the family life was about. A physical thing that everybody could ride around, caveman and jazz.
Imagine that has its own challenges.
Right, I was gonna say, because of some of the same.
That's still very.
So I guess.
Showcase.
We had a community and it has to camp in the summer, 17-year-old, it didn't matter where they came from. You had scholarships for everybody that wanted to come. And 7-year-old. So it works. It did, but it's for that one day, and they build some friendships. And I think it's care less if I lived in.
That's why.
All
Right.
lived in Jacksonville.
Right. Well, and I was,
Yeah, it's me,
you know, hopefully they understand that they do have.
year long. Yeah, year long. No.
But so I think sometimes the.
Well, most of the kids, they came in the city.
What's important to them.
Yeah, you know, because they were the non-payers. They had scholarships. But, yeah, payers too. But you have, that's one way to make it. That's not
So.
lasting. It is the thing.
It's either all trigger because it's not all together. Or it's probably the most good.
Right, right. And they could, yeah, they could ride each other.
Select. Or, you know, somebody.
Right, I would
Yeah.
have another option.
Yeah.
It's funny because I was thinking that, because I remember like.
Well, you just, what's lasting?
And I was thinking. You know, imagine.
That you can't literally not have, you have to say it's for,
And to not.
or it was for, you know, it was for.
Yeah.
You know, the question is just which one.
Right.
This goes to 1 Thursday.
They choose to do alternatives as well.
But yeah, others might choose to identify the disease. And it's really easy to know. This is the network that's not lasting enough. I think the first is
And what I saw, you know, what I saw also was the kids that came when they were 7 came back when till they should age down or some counts.
Yeah.
Okay, so what did we think? Let's start with this group. You guys come up with.
Including them in normal activities.
Okay, including them in normal, good. We saw that, I saw that in the Zoom chat too. So I want to dig into this for a second. What do we mean by including them in normal activities? What do we actually?
Is that social media groups? Is it, you know, is it a club? Is it a camp? Is it? You
Yeah,
know,
like what are we doing? What are we trying to do with that?
Well, what we were talking about is some foster parents I've worked with in the past do not include the children in family activities. So they're separate.
Okay,
They
okay.
don't allow the children to go out to eat with them. They get a babysitter for that. They don't allow children to go on vacations with them. They're
they
left
get
behind.
arrested, yeah.
Okay.
So
Ouch.
that
Okay.
just separates them even more. So they need to be included in all those family things.
Yeah.
And then we also talked about like school activities and kind of brainstormed ideas of how to get how to get foster kids involved when, money might be tight with the caregivers. And there usually are resources, but maybe people are not aware.
Okay, so financially supporting, so that when they want to do the field trip to
Yes.
whatever and they need that
Yeah,
$50.
there should be no question.
Okay,
And also mentioned was the fact that these kids in school, like Johnny said, if they start a new school and they don't have good clothes, good shoes to start, to make that available to them so that they feel like they are part of what every other child is experiencing in school and not be bullied or stigmatized for that one reason.
so give them access to mainstream items, right? So having the shoes that are on point, having the nice backpack, having a phone, or, whatever it is that like all of my peers have this and I don't because I'm in care. Absolutely. What else?
We talked about kind of focusing in the peer networking and outside of just the school system, but camps and summer camps and opportunities for peer networking and just creating an atmosphere for normalization is the word I would use.
Nice. So doing things to promote. And again, summer camps are amazing idea. That's also a really complicated idea, right? Like that's a big endeavor. So something as simple as like, hey, if we can get 2 foster families together so that their children can interact, so they can create, have a friendship of somebody who's in a similar situation. That's, small. So we can do this at a large level with this like summer camp. We can do this at an individual family level
Does that
or somewhat in between.
getting 2 foster families together, though, does that violate right to privacy?
That's a CASA question.
I think a lot of the agencies get together. So like if they're licensed through one particular agency, that agency will get their families together. So we need to talk to them. There you go.
So online, we talked about attending functions as well. So, having somebody present at school games and activities as an adult, and that doesn't have to be the caregiver, right? That could be CASA, that can be somebody, but just so that when everybody else is cheering, that child knows I have a cheering section too, of whoever that is for them. Another thing, and I actually wanted to discuss this a little bit because I think this will jump into the next one. So one of our participants online said, when possible, avoid using terms like foster parents, foster home, group home, facility, etc. when in public with the child, anything that might cause someone else to think of the child differently. So doing some protection of the child's status. I bring that up as kind of an interesting one because I think to an extent that's a double-edged sword. Because on one hand, we're doing this proactively, like we don't want to say group home, you're from a group home. We don't want to out these children to other people that may not know their status and might then treat them differently. On the other hand, what are we doing that's a negative coping strategy?
Saying that that's a stigma being involved in that.
We're teaching them to keep a secret. Yeah. So it's kind of that's a line, and I don't have a magic answer. I'm not here to tell you that there's one way that's good or bad, but it's if we reinforce the child, like there's no, you should not be ashamed of the fact that you're in a group home. You should be strong in yourself. But also when we go out to Walmart, I'm going to never use the word group home around you because, we don't have to say that. We'll talk about the home, then the child learns like, okay, well, they're saying the home because being in a group home is bad. So we actually have to be really aware of things that we might be doing to protect the child might also create that stigma to them unless we explain it. If we have that conversation, that's different. But if it's we just avoid using the word and the child doesn't know that we're avoiding it, that child's going to pick up on that because they're going to know, right? Like they're going to understand that you're not using the words, like you're talking differently, you're making euphemisms about it. So that can become a challenge. Somebody else mentioned helping them keep in touch with siblings. And I know that's something we've talked a lot about in training. So, again, helping promote that family connection. Absolutely. giving them access to mainstream things, summer camps, absolutely. Oh, Lee, you were.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, look at that. They got all the ones that we got on the board. Okay. All right. Yep. You know.
I was wondering, just because I was thinking of like parallels, homeschooled kids have homeschooled sports leagues, so that when you're homeschooled and you need to learn competition and playing nicely and sharing and not kicking somebody in the shin or whatever the case might be, you can do a homeschool league in which you get that socialization that might be missed in the school setting. And I didn't know if that was even something that's coordinatable or that peer networking opportunities.
You know, I think the challenge, it becomes, again, it's the label, right? Like, we don't want to have, this is the soccer group for foster care children, like, because then that becomes a challenge. But I agree that like those type of situations, even if it's, okay, well, I can't necessarily get you an extracurricular at the school because of pickup and drop off, but maybe there's a way we can get you in an extracurricular somewhere else. So facilitating that that buy into a group, because that activity, like that identity can be, instead of being the foster care kid, I am the soccer superstar because I'm on my soccer team. And so having a spot where I can be that, and definitely like if we can get other people on the team that are part of that identity that aren't, so then I, not only can I be the soccer star on my team, but also I can still also be the foster care kid, and it doesn't matter. Like that's the goal. Not easy. You know, I say that like it's like, oh, I could just form a soccer league and be like, yeah, everybody's foster care, we're all good. But it's, you know, obviously that's not the way to work. But that's kind of, you know, what we can keep going towards, working towards. So that does lead me into yeah, just kidding. That's on the chat. So that leads me into some of my suggestions. And this is where I was really thinking through the secrecy with the child, because I put on here, you know, being open, honest with the child. But I think there's really a caveat here. Not only being open and honest with the child that's in care, but also being open and honest with children that are not in care. Because again, that's the thing. A lot of these stereotypes, a lot of these assumptions are because they don't have exposure. They don't have knowledge of it. We do a family tree and in class, and the teacher doesn't stand up in there and say, well, not everybody has a mommy and daddy on this tree. Or maybe some people are living with grandma or their aunt or a caregiver. But they could. Right? We could have educators stand up and say, all right, you know, if you like, for example, let me, when I first started working out, I was so scared to go to like a yoga class. 'Cause I'm like, I am not flexible. I'm going to go to this class. I'm going to be completely out of place. And the teacher right off the bat was like, all right, we're going to do this sitting cow position or whatever it was. Obviously I didn't go to yoga still, but but she would say, okay, we're going to do this position. Now, if you have back problems, you know, use this thing. If you have knee problems, use this thing. And so she started listing off all these alterations just automatically, like right off the bat. And it was like, oh, well, I can do this cow position because I'll just use this little thing over here and I'll sit over here. I know you're laughing. Like those of you that I know the cow position. The cow position. Woo. Okay. But so getting that type of advocacy, that type of openness, this clicker is dangerous. I'm gonna set it down. That type of openness is helpful because if we take it out of that secrecy and we start talking about it, when we do the family tree in second grade, if we can have teachers talk about, okay, like we're doing our family tree, here's the different types of families, right? If we start looking for increased exposure to it so that children are like, oh yeah, that's a foster care, that's a foster situation. I've heard about that before, you know, things like that can really help. So not only focusing on honesty and communication with the child that you're actually dealing with in care as a CASA volunteer, but also those other, not, I was going to say other kids, it sounds terrible, but those kids who are not in care and are in some way associated with individuals in care or going to experience individuals in care and giving them the tools to talk honestly and openly about that process.
Same thing with adoption, you know, because if you adopt a child and you have cousins that are the same age, you know,
Yep.
If you're not open, it's gonna come out and it may not be on your time, you know.
Exactly.
Timeline, it's better to be open early
Mm-hmm.
and it's not a scary thing for them. Same thing here.
Yeah.
If you can make it not a scary discussion.
Right.
There's all kinds of dynamics.
Yeah. And preparing them, I mean, acknowledging the reality. The reality is there are those stereotypes out there and you are going to have these negative experiences, but that's not everybody. Because we might not be able to change everybody else's behavior, but that perception that everybody's biased and stereotyped against me, we can work on that. And we can work on don't shut yourself down because there might be someone that's going to treat you badly, but there might be someone that's going to be really good for you. And so, giving them the skills.
Kids end up in the adoption family too.
Yep.
Not always go home.
Yeah, that's
You
true.
know?
Yep.
And there has to be that discussion,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
So the other thing, and we've talked already a lot about this, but creating a safe space for youth who are in care. The research says consistency is key, which, we've heard about that in service training. Having that consistency in their life is so important. Can give them that person believes in me and they stayed in my life. So therefore, maybe I am worth something. Maybe I can overcome this label that I've been assigned and I didn't do anything to deserve. And then again, reiterating that not only peer network is so important, but actually having foster care peers. Having the opportunity to network with people that are in a situation like them is so helpful for children just because it helps them not feel like the other. They're finally in a space where they're not the other, they're part of a group that unfortunately are the other for a lot of other people, but for that purpose, for that moment, they're not the other in that room. And that can be really important for their self-esteem. Building resilient skills and self-esteem, if you stop looking so much to the other people to identify your value, then you're going to be able to hold that value regardless. And so working on those skills with the children that are in care. And then the other thing that came up a lot, and this is one of those chain of events. So low self-esteem creates a negative self-image. Negative self-image oftentimes has that mental health challenge, but it also has this lack of long-term planning, this purpose of, well, I mean, who am I? It's not going to change anything anyway. I'm just a foster kid. I'm not going to make it. That article I was talking about that was looking at girls that were in former care, it was like, well, I'm just going to go back and be a prostitute anyway, because that's what all the girls in care do. Like there was a lot of this feeling of hopelessness going forward. And so as a result, those children also had challenges making those long-term goals because they didn't have the motivation. They didn't have that esteem that I'm going to make it long-term. I can be able to do something with my life. So what's the point? And so focusing on that as a volunteer and working with those kids, hey, let's talk. You can go to college. You can do this. Let's talk about the resources that you would need. Let's talk about what you want to do, what incites you, what, invigorates you. And then giving them that, not only the planning, but also that feedback. Like, hey, did you know you're really good at math and you should think about these other programs and, giving them that exposure.
What about the kids that go into foster care and they're tossed around 2 or 3 homes because they're challenged? They're challenging to stay, in a home, and then they end up in a residential place. Is there any kind of connection or a foster system that stays with them even if they're institutionalized till they age out? Or is it the institution's responsibility saying, well, y'all just keep them till they age out and let's see if we can keep them out of jail, when they age out? Does anybody?
My CASA workers, we have. I feel like it's kind of the institution is, we've placed you, we're done. I mean, unfortunately.
If somebody's washing their hand so these kids from, early are a bit abandoned by the system or whatever. We say there's a system to try to help you, but they're not fit. There's not a great fit for them to stay out of there. So they go now into this institution. My daughter is a nurse manager of a inpatient facility, and she has 4-year-olds brought in shackles because nobody wants these kids. They can't, and they live there till they're
And that's,
And then they go to jail.
and unfortunately, that's that labeling part, right? Like when when you have these young kids coming in, they're handcuffed, they're part of the system, like there's that internalization of, I'm just a bad kid, or I'm part of the system, I'm a criminal, I'm a bad kid, I'm troublemaker,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Where's the voice for that child? I'm a helicopter mom myself, so I don't understand it. If I'm supposed, that's why I came to CASA. You think, okay, they don't have a helicopter mom, so maybe I can be one. And then you get kind of too invested, what I'm saying? But what happens?
Well, I think part of it is right now, I think we don't know what's gonna happen. When CPS was not great, okay, but I would say that easily 60% of the social workers that I work, the caseworkers that I work with, were really good. And I had a kid from the time she was 8 until she aged out at 18. And she was fortunate enough, she had, I don't know how many social workers, okay? But as she got older, she was lucky enough to fall into the purview of some really terrific people who did helicopter for her. But now we don't have CPS, so, we can't. Arrow may be wonderful, they may be 80% wonderful, but they could also be 40% wonderful. And we just don't know yet because they're so new, the deregulation of CPS is still so new.
Well, and again, this is where, so we had Christy wrote in chat, like that's the importance of CASA, of being that person for the child. And I think that's true, but I also think what you're talking about is part of being a good CASA advocate is also trying to work with that child. I mean, you're not always going to succeed, unfortunately, but trying to work with that child to help them build the skills to create that supportive network for themselves, or to identify it before you exit the situation. So, it may not be that you physically or personally can be with them going forward, but if you can help them gain some skills of like, what do you look for in a role model? How do you find somebody? Things like that. Like, it's okay to tell adults about your status, things, if you can teach a child, they don't have to hide their status and they can share it with somebody, then if they share it with the next person, they might be able to find a support ongoing, so.
And if they're not intellectually capable.
That, yes. Yeah. I mean,
where's that voice?
I know, and unfortunately, this is, like I said, this is not you're going to do this magic fix and it's going to be done. But there are things that you can think about, and especially knowing like, okay, these are some of the common things that children do, and then actively trying to work with your child. To be honest, like one of the things I saw a lot when I did my research on children of registrants is there was a lot of anger. And what would happen was the child and the spouses too, the child and the spouses would be upset with the person who's on the registry because, your actions led us here. But then there's also this whole, well, our life sucks right now because of the registry, so I can't be mad at my dad or my mom. And so I just have all this anger and I'm just going to hold it in. I'm going to keep it, contained. And then eventually I'm going to have this huge outburst. So some of what I talked a lot with the parents was, you just need to acknowledge that it's okay that you feel awful. Like you can sit down with your child and you can tell your child, you can be mad at me and that is okay. Like it is okay to feel that way. You do not have to hide that. I understand that, where that anger comes from. Obviously not like just like let yourself explode whenever you want, but acknowledging that the feelings exist is huge. And so acknowledging to these kids, you are going to feel stigmatized. You are going to feel isolated. And I want you to know, like, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with feeling that, but here's what we can do if you feel that way. Like, just really, acknowledging those concerns. Cause I do think that's one thing that, like I said, when in that chat suggestion, it kind of got me about, we don't want to out them and make them the other in social situations, but we also don't want to teach them that they have to hide their identity. And if that's already a coping skill that we know and we can be aware of, we can watch for that. And we would be able to say, okay, with this child, this is the age appropriate and situation appropriate discussion to have with this child so that they don't keep holding it in and keep becoming secret and isolated. Yeah, Christy said, just listen, let them vent, know that they're safe to vent with you, exactly. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to do is I have a couple more quotes, and I just wanted to have us read the quote and then just kind of brainstorm, like, what are specific things that we think we could do for this child based on some of the information that we've seen. Starting with, I don't like to say anything. People treat you, I mean, I feel like people like change their attitude around you. Like if they know you're in foster care, people know that I'm in foster care. Not all the time they treat me badly, but some of the time they do. And this is a 13-year-old girl that's saying this. So what do we tell Tia? What can we do to help in this situation?
I think that allowing them to have their voice and find things that they are proud of, that I don't want to say so much a comeback, but have them teach them ways to feel confident in themselves.
Okay.
Because there's always going to be people, obviously, that have a stigma about someone else. I mean, that's just,
Right, it has
human
nothing to
nature.
do with foster care at 13.
Right.
Get out here, girl, it's just crap, period,
A lot of the challenges with any population, not just children in foster care, but we have perceptions of things, and those perceptions may not be reality, right? So so Tia feels like they're changing how they treat me because I'm in foster care, and maybe that's reality, maybe that's not. But at the same time, we also, we want to empathize with Tia that that's her perception of the reality. So we have to agree with that perception. We don't want to tell her like, you're just being crazy. That's nothing. Nothing, don't worry about it. But at the same time, teaching her, okay, well, when you're feeling that way, what are some other things that we can do? Or is there a place like this might be a great situation if she's feeling like I'm treated differently because I'm in foster care. Tia might be a great person to hook up with a support group. Maybe she would be really helped by having some other girls or boys her age that she knows that are also in care, so that then, hey, these people are not going to treat me differently when I'm around them.
It's something as simple as they're getting that from the teacher.
True.
And they go talk to the teacher.
Absolutely.
See what kind of resources might be available to the teacher to become more educated.
Yep. Teacher education is so important. There's so many times like we do things in the classroom, and a lot of times we don't know what we're doing until we do it, right? I have changed the way I do some of my teaching to be more sensitive to children's identity with regards to gender identity. And that came about, unfortunately, because I had a situation where it was a stats example. It was just something I needed to do real fast as an activity. And I went around the room and I had people tell me their favorite color and their gender real fast. And we did it up on the board, and we were learning a stats program. And I had a student who did not identify with the gender identity that they were born with. And so that individual, I got to that individual, and it was are you male, female? And they were like, that doesn't fit for me. And that caused me to like, I hadn't experienced that before. It's the first time I had a student that came up and outed themselves like that. So then I had a discussion with the student. I apologized. I'm like, I did not mean to put you in a situation that would have made you uncomfortable. And then from here on, I was like, okay, well, what can I do? Because I didn't need to know their gender. It was just used for the example. And so now I'm really careful when I do example. Now I do like, what's your favorite kind of ice cream instead? Because I'm not going to face that issue. So sometimes it might be something like maybe that teacher that's assigning the family tree, maybe she hasn't had a child in foster care in her class before. And so maybe she's just not aware, or he, that this could be a challenge. And so maybe if we talk to that teacher and that teacher thinks, okay, how could I present this assignment differently? It might be something as simple as that. So yeah, absolutely. If I told them it's a secret, it would just spread. I think they would say, I'm not going to be your friend anymore just because you're in foster care. And then they would go and find like new friends. This little 8-year-old.
In my era, if you were from a divorced family, you could lose friends. You can't stay at my house because you're divorced.
Yep.
You had families that actually said that to
Mhm.
kids.
My husband, his mom, he was one of 5, and his mom left his dad over some serious physical abuse. And they were in the Mormon church at the time, and as a result of that, then they left the Mormon church and they were in Utah. And so it was very much a big social thing. And he has family members that to this day will not acknowledge him because they left the church. So I mean, this is not the only reason this happens, but it's definitely for these children, it's a primary
It's
identity
real
for them.
yes,
Mhm.
it's something they're experiencing.
So what do you think we could do for Sinead?
I think the 2 words that come to mind is validate the experience and find opportunity to build confidence, internal confidence, and minimize internal scrutiny.
Okay.
Just let them know that that's not their identity, being a foster kid, that's not something, like, this is me, this is your circumstance maybe, but this isn't you. And validate what actual identity is in them,
You're smart, you're strong, you're brave,
Absolutely.
you're creative, that's that confidence
There's a difference
building.
between what you are and who you
Absolutely. And yeah, we, 8 years old, we're prime, we're getting into that, making our own identity that's separate from our caregivers. And so huge important time to talk about that. Maybe also digging in, has this individual had this happen before? And then maybe talking through that experience with them, because this seems pretty specific. So I feel like this is either something they've heard from somebody else or something they've experienced themselves. And so maybe talking through what actually happened, and then highlighting okay, well, just because that one person did it, that does happen, but let's talk about some of the other people that when you said that they haven't left, and just getting them to recognize we are very quick in our minds to find things that confirm our perceptions. And so we will ignore all of the evidence to the alternative. And so sometimes it's a matter of someone trying to get us to sit down all right, really think this through. Think about your last 4 friends that you had, or the last 4 people you met. Which of them treated you differently because of your status? How did you approach these situations, things like that. So. Okay, well, that is all I have, and I do have a reference slide at the end. So, Jared, you said you'll be sharing the slides.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.